You have done your annual. The mechanics signed the logbook. The FAA says it is airworthy. So why did the wing come off? 4 aircraft, 4 states, 4 separate decades. Each time, the NTSB found the same fracture at the same location, a crack growing in a place no inspector had ever been told to look. The FAA knew about the first accident in 1987. The last one happened in 2018. The mandatory inspection directive finally arrived in 2021. This is not about pilot error. This is about a regulatory system that decided, in writing, that accumulating more crashes before acting was the acceptable path forward. When the FAA wants to ground an aircraft, it has one tool, the airworthiness directive. An airworthiness directive is not a suggestion from the manufacturer. It is not a service bulletin you can defer until next quarter. It is a binding federal rule under 14 CFR Part 39. Every registered aircraft must comply before the next flight. The system works through the Corrective Action Review Board, CARB. When investigators identify a pattern, it goes to the CARB. When the CARB determines an unsafe condition exists, an airworthiness directive gets written. The theory is clean. But 5 documented cases spanning the general aviation fleet say the theory and the practice are not the same thing. The gap between the first confirmed fatal accident and the first mandatory fix tells you everything about how this institution decides what counts as sufficient evidence to act. Before going aircraft by aircraft, run the aggregate numbers first. Between 1947 and 1984, the Beechcraft Bonanza V-tail accumulated 232 documented in-flight structural failures. More than 500 people died. Independent studies found the V-tail's fatal in-flight failure rate was 24 times higher than Beechcraft's own straight-tail, Model 33. The mandatory structural fix arrived in the late 1980s, more than 37 years after the first aircraft left the factory. The FAA's own 2010 Federal Register notice on Cessna seat rails acknowledged receiving several reports of accidents, some fatal, in the 20 years after the 1987 Airworthiness Directive was already in force. 36,000 aircraft were in scope, 2 decades of fatal accidents after the rule existed. The Piper PA-28 and PA-32 wing Spar produced a fatal accident in 1987. The first comprehensive mandatory inspection directive covering that fleet arrived in 2021. 34 years, 10,927 aircraft were in the scope of a single September 2024 expansion. 7 Piper Malibu airframes went down in 22 months, May 1989 through March 1991, before an emergency directive restricted autopilot use. Of 1,119 Cessna 10 carry-through Spars inspected in the United States following a 2019 fatal wing separation in Australia, 499 showed corrosion and 68 were removed from service as unairworthy. 1 in roughly 15 inspected aircraft had a Spar too degraded to fly. Every one of those numbers is in a government document, written by the agencies that were supposed to prevent them. The question is not whether the FAA knew. They wrote it down. Ralph Harmon designed the Beechcraft Bonanza V-tail in 1945. Walter Beech called it a miracle of aeronautical design, and the market believed him. There were 1,400 advance orders before a single production aircraft had been delivered. The airplane first flew on December 22, 1945. Production began immediately, and Beechcraft delivered close to 1,000 aircraft in the first year alone. They were priced at $7,975 apiece. These were the post-war boom years, and the Bonanza's sleek V-tail and 175 miles per hour cruise speed made it the most aspirational aircraft on any ramp in America. Every airport had one. Every doctor, every lawyer, every successful businessman who learned to fly wanted to own one. There was a detail in the pre-certification test program that did not make the brochures. During a 1946 high-speed dive test, the prototype V-tail separated from the fuselage. The test pilot died. Walter Beech ordered continued testing, and the airplane went into production. The structural problem that would spend the next 4 decades claiming casualties was not mysterious. The leading edges of the V-tail ruddervators were cantilevered too far ahead of their main spars. At the right combination of airspeed and turbulence, those surfaces entered flutter. Flutter, at this scale, does not damage an airframe, it disintegrates one. Beechcraft's official position, held for decades in published statements, was that the in-flight breakups were caused by pilots flying into severe turbulence. The company insisted the design was sound. The numbers said otherwise. Between 1947 and 1984, 230 V-tail Bonanzas experienced in-flight structural failures. More than 500 people died. Independent studies put the fatal in-flight failure rate at 24 times that of Beechcraft's own straight-tail Model 33, a structurally identical aircraft except for the tail. Beechcraft produced the V-tail until 1982, 35 years after the first deliveries, and then quietly discontinued the line. The FAA and Department of Transportation launched a formal investigation in 1984 after the president of the American Bonanza Society reversed the organization's long-standing pro-manufacturer position following a close friend's fatal breakup. Wind tunnel and flight testing ultimately confirmed what independent researchers had been publishing for years. Under certain conditions, the V-tail design did not meet the structural certification standards it had been certificated to in 1947. The mandatory tail reinforcement kit arrived in the late 1980s. After the fix, the in-flight breakup rate dropped sharply. The airworthiness directive that addressed the problem came after more than 230 documented structural failures, more than 500 confirmed fatalities, and more than 4 decades of production and operation. The Cessna seat rail defect is so well understood among mechanics that it generated its own pre-takeoff ritual. You have probably done it. Pull the seat forward, release the handle, rock your hips side to side before releasing the brakes. That habit is called the Cessna butt wiggle. It exists because the seat lock system on decades of Cessna high-wing singles cannot be trusted to stay engaged without manual verification. The failure mechanism is straightforward. The seat latch pin engages a hole in the aluminum track. As the tracks wear over thousands of flight hours, those holes elongate. The seat appears locked. On takeoff rotation, it releases. The pilot slides rearward and grabs the control yoke. The aircraft pitches sharply, nose up. Below 500 feet, there is no recovery. A wave of accidents in the mid-1980s produced Airworthiness Directive 87-2003 issued in 1987. 23 years later, the FAA's own 2010 Federal Register rulemaking notice stated that the agency had received several reports of accidents, some fatal, in the 20 years since that airworthiness directive was in force. Howard Holton, an Anchorage City engineer, died in September 2007 when the seat retention pins failed on takeoff in his borrowed Cessna 180. At that point, less than 10% of affected aircraft had installed the free Cessna-funded correction kit. In 2011, an enhanced airworthiness directive superseded the 1987 version. Approximately 36,000 US registered aircraft were in the rule's scope. The original design flaw was never fundamentally corrected. The ritual wiggle is still standard practice, 40 years on. The Piper Malibu told a different version of the same story. The PA-46 launched in 1983 as the prestige aircraft of the piston single market. It was pressurized and capable of 23,000 feet, powered by a Continental TSIO 520BE engine designed specifically for this aircraft, with 8 quarts of oil, while comparable engine variants used 12 quarts. It had no cowl flaps and inadequate heat dissipation. Engine failures accumulated from the first deliveries. Between May 1989 and March 1991, 7 Malibu and Mirage airframes worldwide were destroyed following departures from controlled flight. 5 were in the United States. An emergency directive restricted autopilot modes. The FAA ordered the most comprehensive special certification review ever conducted on a light aircraft. It took nearly a year of work and produced 60 recommendations. The review concluded the airframe met certification standards. It identified pilot training as the root cause. The production solution had already arrived. Piper replaced the Continental engine with a Lycoming TIO 540 in the Mirage in 1989. In later studies, engine failures accounted for 27% of Malibu accidents in the Continental years, dropping to 10% after the engine change. The installation was the problem. The official findings said otherwise. On March 30, 1987, a Piper P. T. Corpo 28-181 conducting pipeline patrol near Marlin, Texas, separated its left wing in cruise flight. The sole occupant died. NTSB materials analysis found fatigue cracking at the outboard bolt holes of the lower main wing spar cap. The aircraft had 7,490 total hours. 36 days later, the FAA issued Airworthiness Directive 870808. Both wings had to be pulled on every PA-28 and PA-32 in the country. A physical inspection of the lower spar cap was mandatory. A mechanic in Dillingham, Alaska named William Johnson pulled the wings off every PA-32 in the UTAIR fleet. Every single one had cracks at the inspection point. He filed malfunction and defect reports to the FAA, over 40 of them. On September 28, 1987, 5 months after the Airworthiness Directive was issued, the FAA rescinded it. The stated reason was that the inspection process itself was causing damage to the bolt holes. Probing the area susceptible to fatigue was initiating new fatigue cracks. Of 559 aircraft inspected before the rescission, 2 cracked spars were found, both in severe use aircraft. The FAA documented finding was that the safety benefit did not justify the risk caused by the inspection. Piper issued a voluntary service bulletin in 1988. It was not an airworthiness directive, and it was not required. In 1993, a second PD-28-180 experienced wing separation in Provincetown, Massachusetts at 11,683 hours. Fatigue cracks were confirmed at the same bolt holes. On April 4, 2018, a Piper Cherokee 28R201 Arrow, operated by Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, lost its left wing during initial climb at 900 feet over Daytona Beach. A designated pilot examiner and a commercial pilot applicant died. The aircraft had 7,691 total hours. The fatigue crack had consumed more than 90% of the lower spar cap's cross-section before separation. The cracks were undetectable visually. A second Embry-Riddle Arrow in the same fleet was immediately inspected and also found to have cracks. The only method capable of detecting these cracks before they reached critical size was a high-frequency eddy current bolt hole inspection. Piper's 1988 service bulletin threshold would not have applied to the 2018 accident aircraft for another 23,000 flight hours. Airworthiness Directive 2020-26-16, the first comprehensive mandatory PA-28 and P-32 SPAR inspection directive, was issued January 15, 2021. This came 34 years after the 1987 fatal accident. 3 fatal accidents occurred at the same fracture point, the same location, in the same family of aircraft in between. William Johnson's 40-plus malfunction and defect reports sat in a database for 3 decades. The Cessna. 210 Centurion's cantilever wing carries every structural load on a single machined aluminum beam running through the cabin. When Cessna eliminated the wing strut in the 1960s, that bracing load moved entirely to this one component, the carry-through spar. There is no backup. Cessna's original maintenance program addressed this with flight hour-based eddy current inspections. Eddy current is the only method capable of detecting internal fatigue cracks before they grow to critical size. A visual inspection of the spar surface finds surface corrosion. It cannot find what is growing inside the metal. In 2011, Textron replaced the eddy current schedule with a visual inspection required every 3 years. The stated rationale was that no spar cracking had been identified in the 19 years the prior program was in place. The design feature that had been hiding the corrosion was cosmetic foam padding glued to the lower spar surface with a high hygroscopic adhesive. The padding was there for cabin finishing. The moisture-attracting glue beneath it had been slowly drawing water onto the most structurally critical component in the aircraft. Because the padding covered it, nobody had been looking. On May 26, 2019, a Cessna T210M conducting low-level geophysical survey work near Mount Isa, Queensland, Australia, lost its right wing in flight. Both occupants died. The Australian Transport Safety Bureau found a fatigue fracture that had grown from a corrosion pit on the lower spar surface, exactly where the 2011 inspection downgrade had removed mandatory eddy current examination 8 years earlier. The Australian Transport Safety Bureau concluded explicitly that if the previous eddy current inspection schedule had remained in place, it is almost certain the fatigue crack would have been detected before the accident occurred. Of 1,119 US Cessna 210 owners who submitted inspection reports following the accident, 499 showed corrosion and 68 spars were condemned as unairworthy. The Federal Aviation Administration Airworthiness Directive 2020-02-05 took effect. March 9, 2020. If your last Cessna 210 or Cessna 177 annual inspection included a visual spar inspection but not an eddy current inspection, you had the same level of information the Australian Transport Safety Bureau specifically found to be insufficient. 5 aircraft were documented in federal rulemaking notices, NTSB accident reports, and international safety investigations. Fatal accident patterns were recorded, formally acknowledged, and traceable through public documents years before the mandatory fix arrived. The sign-off on your annual logbook is not a guarantee of safety. It is a snapshot of what a regulatory framework decided to require, and in these 5 documented cases, that decision and the accident record were running on very different timelines.